Yes, and it's being live streamed as well. Well, I guess that's the same thing in a virtual world.
Mhm.
Jason, I take it you are now the only one so far.
No, Cammie is here.
I'm here as well.
Okay, I can't see you. I only see Jason.
I
I'm gonna
promise I'm not hiding.
be on my phone tonight, so
Okay.
I'll be here. I'm gonna mute myself. Welcome.
Thanks. Glad to be back.
Good evening, Mr. Brown. Just want to let you know I'm listening to your meeting, but I'm also running the city council meeting.
Okay, understood. Very well.
But
Sounds
I
like
think
double
I
duty.
think you should be good to go.
Yeah. Hi, Cammie.
Hi there. How are you?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm well, thanks.
James?
Hey,
Mr.
guys.
Mendez?
Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Great.
Mr. Wechter, thank you for joining us this evening.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, I don't count Bellamy?
I did say Bill. I said, I saw you earlier today. I mean, it's enough, but.
You did. Brian, are you multitasking?
Oh, Philip. Oh, Philip, I can't. Do you have a video? I can't see you.
Yeah, you don't want to see me.
I think I have this. I did something like 2 meetings ago where it only shows people on the screen, nobody off the screen. I don't know how to fix it back. But hi, Philip. Oh, there's Miss
There I
Hudson.
am.
There you
Hello.
go. How's it
You're
going?
walking. You're outside.
Going well. Yes. We're having a moment with Miss Maggie.
Yeah. Hi, Cynthia. How are you?
I'm fine. Good evening to you all.
Good evening to you as well. All right. We have 1, 2, 3. So Phillips, that's 4. So I didn't hear back from Ms. Gilmore, and I guess we'll give it another few minutes for Ms. Carpenter. Let me see here. James, do you have her contact by chance?
It might take me a minute. Nancy's phone number.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me see if I got it in here.
I did touch base with Ms. Carpenter, and she said she was going to try to access Zoom via her mobile phone. Sounded like
Okay.
she did not have her computer with her,
Okay. Gotcha.
but she does have a fresh link to her personal email address.
Okay. So I guess we'll start at 6:35 then.
Okay.
Bellamy, that information I provided you, did that help at all?
I am waiting to, it did, I'm waiting to hear back on that, but I'll definitely move forward in pursuing that.
All right.
Looks like Miss Gilmore's here. That's good. So let's do this here. Send message. Training. Oh, there she is. Okay. So it looks like everyone is here now. Hi, Nancy. Or Miss Carpenter. Hi, Miss Gilmore. And so since we have everyone here, this is our, I guess, third NACOL training, police civilian oversight training. And of course we have Campbell McElhaney with us, and she'll introduce, I guess, our guest speaker for this evening. So I'll turn it over to you, Cami.
Great, thank you very much. Let me just bring up the presentation for tonight. There we go. So it's good to be back with all of you again tonight for training or educational session number 3. So tonight I am joined by Jason Wechter, who is a longtime NACOL member and has been involved in the civilian oversight field for a very long time. And actually, Jason, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself.
Okay, thank you, Cami. So I'm Jason Wechter. I'm in San Francisco, and I've worked as an investigator for a little over 40 years. I started out as a criminal defense investigator, and that work highlighted issues with how police investigated themselves. So in 1982, when San Francisco voted to establish civilian oversight, I campaigned for the creation of that agency. Went to work there as one of their first supervising investigators, and discovered that unfortunately it did not have the support of the mayor or the police commission. So it was not functioning well. I left. I worked for the public defender's office, worked in private practice doing criminal defense, and in 1998 returned to the police oversight agency here, the Office of Citizen Complaints. I was there for almost 19 years. And then I spent 3 years doing EEO investigations. And now I'm back doing civilian oversight investigations in Oakland as a temporary employee, investigating their police department's handling of the protests following George Floyd's murder last summer.
Thank you, Jason. So before we get started, I just want to do what we did at the last one. I just wanted to make sure there weren't any follow-up questions from the last session that we did before we moved on. Okay. Well, without any being heard, I will move on to just do the quick overview of tonight's training. So tonight's training is on effective practices in the conducting and reviewing of investigations. I think we had mentioned in some earlier trainings that as review board members, even though you may not be hands-on doing the investigations, it's important to know what goes into good investigations and what to look for as you're reviewing them. Tonight, Jason's going to be going over the characteristics of good and bad investigations, issues and questions driving an investigation, and also investigation review. And with that, I will turn it over to Jason for the rest of the presentation. Oh, and
Okay.
well, I'm sorry, Jason, one more thing. Just as we're going, much like our last educational session, if you have questions as we're going, please let us know and we'll stop and answer them along the way.
Yes, I'm hoping this will be as participatory as possible. So as I said, I've been an investigator for a long time, done a lot of police misconduct investigations, and I've distilled from that experience my sense of what the characteristics of a bad investigation for civilian oversight of law enforcement are and a good investigation. And so I'm starting with the bad because people often want the bad news first. And so you'll be able to recognize some of these things. So first of all, a poor investigation is going to have a very narrow focus. It's only going to look at things in a fairly limited way, not search for other possibilities, not look for other possible allegations or violations of policy. The investigator may make assumptions, and those can be assumptions about the complainant, civilian witnesses, the witness or subject officers, or a situation. And often these assumptions may be made on someone's own experience, which is often going to be limited, and it may reflect bias, which I'm going to talk about in a little while. But I want to go back to something about the narrow focus, because I want to give you a little more detail about that. It would involve overlooking relevant facts and evidence, failing to identify, as I said, all the allegations, failing to obtain a complete narrative account from all the individuals who were interviewed, and I'll go into more detail about that, failing to address inconsistencies in an interview subject's account. So that would be, an example of this would be, someone tells you what happened and you don't ask follow-up questions to clarify things, to determine whether they know that from direct experience, whether they heard it from someone else, whether they formed a conclusion that's part of their statement rather than what they actually saw and heard. Failure to hold supervisors accountable, to ask what training did you receive, to consider who else may be responsible for an officer's actions, for failing to hold them accountable for adherence to policy or practice, and failing to consider systemic issues. So these would be things like failures in, when I say deficiencies in training, in policy, in supervision, or resources. So you might find that an agency is not properly training their officers on how to perform a certain task, or there is no really effective policy on that. It hasn't been revised in decades, or the supervision is lax and they're not holding officers accountable, or maybe they don't have sufficient resources. Maybe an officer is going to interview someone who's reported a crime whose first language is not English, and they do not have access to something like Language Line, where you can call from your cell phone and tell them what language you want, and they will get an interpreter on the phone, and you can then communicate with that person. In San Francisco, in fact, our officers carry cards with all the languages commonly spoken in the San Francisco Bay Area, so they can show it to that person, they can point to the language they are conversing in, and the officer can then call up Language Line and get an interpreter available. So third is potential bias. And this would be lack of awareness of their own personal biases or ignoring those personal biases. And it can also manifest itself in a failure to notify supervisors of real or perceived conflicts of interest. So a real conflict of interest would be an internal affairs investigator is investigating a complaint involves his brother-in-law or someone he's on a sports team with. That might be a very real conflict. Or there might be some connection that would cause the public to feel that there was a perceived bias, which again should be brought to the attention of a superior and say maybe someone else should handle this investigation so there won't be any appearance of conflict or bias. Failing to secure perishable evidence in a timely manner, in other words, letting it get stale. By perishable, I mean things like photographing someone's injuries. If someone makes a complaint, they claim they were injured as a result of an encounter with police that happened the day before, 2 days before, 3 days before. You want to document those injuries photographically. Even if there are no visible injuries, you want to document that the areas where the person said they may have been struck may have sustained an injury, because bruises in particular are going to fade over a period of time. If you don't document them when they're there, then you've lost that evidence. Same would be true of CCTV camera footage. You know, the cameras we see on the street, outside banks, office buildings, various businesses. Those are usually recorded digitally, but the hard drives have a limited capacity. So they're only going to be kept for a certain period of time. If you don't get to the owner of that video system promptly enough, you're going to lose that evidence. It's going to be recorded over. And then interviewing witnesses who might become unavailable. Maybe it's someone who's only in town for a short period of time. Maybe it's someone who is unhoused and you're going to have difficulty locating them later. Or it may be someone whose recollection will fade or become contaminated over time, because a month or 2 months later, they're not going to remember it as clearly. They may be exposed to media information or information from other sources, and that may contaminate contaminate their recollection. Disorganized or unfocused. So this would mean no investigation plan or an inadequate investigation plan. And that's something we're going to talk about in relation to the scenario I gave you. Every investigation should have a written plan at the outset that's going to define the issues, the allegations, the questions, and the sources of information that the investigator is going to look at. And this is something that's going to change over time as more information becomes available. It's going to outline the documents, the evidence, and the witnesses that you want to do, and also something about the time frame. And I know you have a fairly tight time frame, I think 75 days for completion of your investigations. A lot of those things you would want to be done in a much shorter time frame, much sooner. Poor documentation of the investigation. And that would mean not documenting all the steps you're taking. If you try and contact someone, not making a note of that. So someone else, so your supervisor is going to know. So someone who's completely unfamiliar with the case should be able to pick up that file and know very exactly what's been done. And if they had to take over that investigation, they can do that based on the information provided. I talked about timeliness, unnecessary or unjustified delays in the investigation. I said, was someone going to ask a question? Okay. You want to
No,
look at any?
I'm sorry. I did have one, Mr. Rector. Sorry.
Yes, please.
You had mentioned that the 75-day was a bit long. What is I guess a standard or an ideal?
Oh, no, I said it's short. It is a very short period of time. In California, we have a statutory requirement to notify an officer of discipline within 1 year of when you learn of the potential misconduct. On a practical level, that means the investigation should be completed within 6 to 8 months. So we have much more time. But depending on the case, you may want to move very quickly to gather evidence, to interview witnesses. And we'll talk about that with the example case, about things you would want to do fairly quickly.
Okay.
Then we have poorly done interviews. So these would be things like failing to establish rapport with the interview subject, failing to put them at ease. For the internal affairs investigator, interviewing is what they do every day. They're very familiar with it. They're very relaxed about it. For members of the public who they're interviewing, this is something very unfamiliar, very strange, and possibly very threatening or stress-inducing. So a good interviewer is going to take time to establish rapport, explain what you're going to be doing, get the person relaxed, give them whatever information you can about the process. because that will give them a greater sense of control. This is particularly true for complainants who are talking about a situation typically where they felt a loss of control. And so when they're recounting it, there may be tied up in with that. So the more control you can give them, information, telling them, at any time, if you want to take a break, we'll do that. If you're feeling a little stressed, we can take a break. I don't want to, make this experience unpleasant for you. And then another manifestation of poorly done interviews would be differential treatment of civilians and officers. And this could be something as subtle as during the interview, referring to the officers, Officer Jones, and referring to the complainant by their first name rather than Mr. or Ms. So-and-so. When I would greet a complainant, I'd always say, good afternoon, Mr. So-and-so or Ms. So-and-so. How would you like me to refer to you? And they may say, please refer to me by my first name, but I want to show them a level of respect. Another manifestation sign of a poorly done interview is the investigator talks more than listens. When you're doing an interview, you want to receive as much information as you can. You want to, at some point, really just shut up and listen. That's the shorthand for explaining that. Similarly, the investigator unnecessarily interrupts someone. You want to allow people to have a flow of information. You want to allow them recall things that may seem significant to them, and interrupting is going to interfere with that. The investigator asking leading or closed questions versus open-end questions. So a leading question suggests the answer in it. So a leading question to an officer might be, were you in fear for your life? Rather than how were you feeling at the time you entered that room or you got out of your patrol car. Open-ended questions are the who, what, where, what happened, how did you react, how were you feeling about that, and then failure to obtain relevant details. Typically, someone's going to give you a narrative account and they're going to highlight things that stand out for them. And then you want to go back and go through it again and ask more detailed questions to get all the nuances out. You want to liken it to like slowing down a film frame by frame so you can really get a sense of what's happening. There may be a lot of things going on in that film frame and you want to be sure you know what all of them are. So that's where you need to ask those details. And if you listen to an interview, and if you read the transcript, you'll get a sense of whether someone is asking relevant details. It's something you can develop over time. When I review my own transcripts or listen to my own interviews, I will say, now you need to ask about this. And hopefully I then do ask about that detail. I do that follow-up. And last would be a poor analysis for the findings that are reached. This might be one-sided or incomplete summary of the evidence. It could be a lack of credibility assessments of witnesses, the complainant, and officers. And credibility assessments should be made according to established credibility factors, which you find in state and federal law in jury instructions. And these are the instructions a judge will give members of a jury about how to evaluate witnesses' testimony. And there are things like consistency or lack of consistency, demeanor. I can't recall the others, but if you want, we did a training on credibility assessment, and we can provide you with the materials for that lists all these factors taken from federal law and California law. I don't know what the law is in Virginia. It's probably very similar, but these are established factors that should be considered in any workplace investigation. And a good report would, at some point, would evaluate each witness's credibility and explain why they feel they're credible or not credible. Maybe you feel they're credible because what they say is consistent with body-worn camera footage, or maybe you feel they are not credible because what their account conflicts with other evidence which is reliable. So now let's go to the good investigation. So here, I think, here you're going to see an open, flexible approach. And this is, the investigator is going to identify all possible violations, including those not raised by the complainant. So for example, a complainant is going to come in, say, I was detained, the officer handcuffed me, they released me, he used a profanity. Now the complainant may not know that the officer has certain reporting requirements. They might have to write a police report. In California, you have to give the person you've detained and handcuffed an actual document called the certificate of release. There may be other things that the officer did not do. The complainant can't articulate those things, but a good investigation will say, let's look at all the officer's behavior in connection with this incident. Did they comply with the rules? Did they comply with department policies? If not, we're going to bring that as an allegation, make that part of our investigation. It's my belief, and I think a lot of people in oversight would agree with me, investigations should not only be complaint driven, but behavior driven. And behavior, I mean the behavior of the officer. You want to identify problems at an early stage. That's why you have an internal affairs unit. That's why you have a complaint process. No matter how minor the complaint might be, it might be rudeness. You want to identify an officer who is having problems conforming to an agency's policies, to the law, and just to good practices, good manners. You want to intervene in that early with training, with remediation, with better supervision, sometimes in discipline. And sometimes you're going to find that officer really isn't cut out for working in this agency. And unfortunately, we've seen that with a number of officers who've gone on in some of the well-publicized officer-involved shootings. Similarly, in a good investigation, you consider possible systemic issues. And again, this goes back to, is the policy poor? Is there no policy in this? So for instance, in San Francisco, going back to the example of language, we have people who speak a very wide variety of languages in San Francisco. We didn't have a very good policy on what officers were supposed to do. Sometimes they would use a relative or a friend who would interpret. Well, that person may not be certified as an interpreter. So now we have memorialized only a certified interpreter can do those interpretations. And it has a whole process officers would go through when they encounter someone who doesn't speak English as a first language. Hold supervisors accountable when warranted. A bad supervisor, a bad sergeant or lieutenant can create a culture that's going to infect a lot of officers. If they're not enforcing the rules, if they are not holding officers accountable, if they're creating a climate where officers feel free to be lax, to feel they can not follow the rules with impunity, that can have a very significant effect. So it's important to hold supervisors responsible and to look at those issues. When you interview an officer, ask them, what was your training about this? What's your understanding about this? Has any supervisor ever talked to you about this? You ask them, have you ever done this in the past? And if they say they have, and if that's out of policy, you may ask, did a supervisor know about this? What, if anything, did they do? So a good investigation is going to be systematic. It's going to draft, follow, and update an investigation plan, identifying the relevant evidence and witnesses. It's going to identify all the policies, rules, and training that are relevant to the officer's actions. You want to know what, sometimes we'll go back and look at what the training curriculum was in a certain subject to understand what standards that officer is being held to, not just in the policies, but in what they were trained. And sometimes we'll interview the instructors, say, what did you talk to about this particular subject? So again, that's a way of establishing the rules and standards you're going to hold the officer accountable to as the investigation goes on. To clearly document the investigative steps. We typically use a chronological log of all investigative steps. And so if I make a phone call and I leave a voicemail message, I'm going to log it in there. So that's memorialized. If I interview someone, I'm going to note the date, time, location, and then make a reference. We audio record all our interviews and say, and the audio recording has been sent for transcription. The transcription is in the file. It's going to be thorough. So you're going to gather all necessary documents and evidence. Now, this may not mean everything that exists out there, but everything that's relevant to and addresses an issue or a question in a case. And when we talk about the Johnson complaint, we're going to talk about a very wide variety of documents and evidence. And that's to give you a sense of the whole constellation of things that are available out there. They may not all be relevant in every case, but it's important to know what's there so you can say, this might have been relevant in this case, but I don't see that in this investigation done by Internal Affairs. Why wasn't this document, this piece of evidence obtained? And it's also going to have a who would know approach. And who would know is a phrase used by an investigative journalist in California. And who could be a person, it could be a document, it could be a piece of evidence, a video recording, an audio recording, and it's something that's going to allow you to answer a question that you need answered, that's going to take you one step further in the investigation. And another element of being thorough is avoiding assumptions about evidence or people. I can give you a great example of this. A complainant came into the office where I worked. He was a very large Latino man, probably 6'6", heavy set. He had a shaved head, a long mustache, wearing a leather vest with rings on all his fingers. And our receptionist came and said, there's kind of a scary looking guy out there. She made an assumption about him based on how he looked. I went to interview him and I said, hello, sir, how are you? My usual introduction. He was very soft-spoken. He gave me a very good narrative account. And unfortunately, police officers also made an assumption about him and stopped and detained him as he was walking down the street because he, quote, looked like he could be a parolee at large. It was based on his appearance, may have been his race, ethnicity. They thought, this looks like someone who's gotten out of prison. Let's stop him. And he took offense to that, and I was able to sustain those officers because I got someone to admit that that is why they stopped them. Excuse me? Oh, okay. I thought that
No,
was
you're fine. Yeah.
Sorry. And then it's going to be timely. And that means they're going to identify and secure that perishable evidence that I talked about earlier. You're going to interview the witnesses who may become unavailable, whose recollections may fade. Make sure that those things aren't potentially lost. Patient, respectful, and thorough interviews. So here, the interviewer is going to recognize the emotional content a complainant or often witnesses to police actions may bring. And for a complainant, sometimes witnesses, they will have experienced trauma. And there's a whole science, and I think NACO has done some training on this, or will be, on trauma-informed interviewing. So it requires a lot of patience, a lot of understanding, and just recognizing that your emotional experience of what someone is telling you about is very different from their emotional experience, and that you're there not just to gather facts for an investigation, but to also let that person feel that they were truly heard, both on a factual level and on an emotional level. And that doesn't mean you're agreeing with what they're saying, with their recitation of the facts, but you're appreciating and recognizing their emotions, saying things that I understand that this may be difficult for you to talk about. I understand that this may have been a very emotional experience for you. Just let them feel that they're being heard. And interviewing complainants, so often I found they just wanted someone to listen patiently to what they had to say. And if you have someone who's taking a, sort of just the facts, ma'am approach, they're not going to get that. They're going to walk away feeling dissatisfied and unheard. and you're not going to do as good an interview. You're not going to get the information you need. Open to all relevant information. So you're going to ask them about everything that happened, not just one thing they might focus on. You want to know, was there other possible misconduct? Is there other possible witnesses? Who did they talk to about this? Because statements a complainant or a witness makes to someone else close in time to an incident can bolster their credibility or diminish their credibility. Consistent statements will bolster their credibility. So in EO investigation, for something like a sexual harassment investigation, there are often no witnesses. So you'll ask the person, who did you talk to about this afterwards? And they'll say, oh, I called my sister. I was in tears. And you then interview the sister and they tell you about that. That's going to help bolster that individual's credibility. Active listening, obtaining a narrative account and using what I would call the inverted pyramid format. And that's where you start very broadly, say, please tell me everything that happened. Tell me everything you remember. And you might go, and then what happened after that? What happened next? Just very open-ended questioning. And then you're going to narrow the focus. You're going to ask clarifying questions. And at the end, you're going to ask questions that are going to resolve inconsistencies. You might say, early on you said this, but then you said this other thing. And I just want to be clear on that. Did I understand that correctly? That's a phrase I use a lot. I want to make sure I'm understanding this properly. That says to them, it's not you who's at fault. Maybe it's my fault because I didn't hear it clearly, didn't register it clearly. And that's also where you might want to ask more difficult questions that you frequently have to ask, like, had you consumed any alcohol, any medications or drugs, things like that, that someone may be a little uncomfortable answering, but you're going to have to ask because those, again, are going to reflect on their credibility. And you clarify the gaps and the inconsistencies, as I mentioned, obtain sufficient details, and open the door for future contact. It's important to let someone know, often at the beginning of the interview, I don't expect you to be able to remember everything. You may think of something later on. Please call me, get in touch with me. I really want to hear that, even if it's very minor. And I often say that again at the end of the interview. You're going to walk out of here, and an hour from now, tonight, tomorrow, you may think, I should have told them about that thing. We've all had that experience, often in a job interview. You come by thinking, why didn't I mention that? Well, you want to tell them, please call me. And you also want to leave the door open to say, is it okay if I contact you if I have additional questions? Because often you're going to need to, as the investigation proceeds, you're going to get some evidence and you're going to want to ask them about that. The good investigation is unbiased. It recognizes, well, first of all, the individual conducting the investigation should not have a bias against anyone based on a protected category, which would mean race, ethnicity, national origin, religion. In California, we also include sexual orientation, gender identification, and for some employers, things like political affiliation. Someone who has a bias against someone on that basis probably shouldn't be in police work to begin with. But we all have personal biases, so you need to recognize it. So you read the complaint and police report for the Dwayne Johnson complaint. So I'm an avid film goer. If a bunch of kids in a movie theater were making noise, I would be unhappy about that. So if I got this complaint, I would say, okay, I wouldn't like that. But then I think to myself, I'm not Jason, the moviegoer right now. I'm Jason Wechter, the complaint investigator. My focus is not on what they did in the theater, whether they were making noise, only to the extent that it's whether they're going to give consistent stories. My focus is, did the police officers behave appropriately? Did they act according to the law and to the rules of their police department? So I'm going to set that aside, and I'm going to say, I'm going to have a focus that doesn't involve those personal feelings. And I'm also going to identify any real or perceived conflicts of interest to a supervisor and say, maybe I should recuse myself from doing this investigation. As I mentioned, I did EO investigations in an organization. I was friends with someone in that organization. So it was established early on. If the person I was friends with ever came up as a witness in any role investigation, I was not going to do that investigation at all. Even though I could set my personal feelings aside, it would create the perception of a possible bias, which we wanted to avoid. So you want to have a mechanism. If someone thinks there's a possible bias conflict, they're going to bring it to the attention of a supervisor, and it's going to be memorialized, and they're going to assign someone else perhaps. But if they say, we don't have anyone else, okay, it was reported, it was discussed, and there was no one else who could do that investigation. So now I think we're going to go to the investigation of the Johnson complaint. And you had an opportunity to read the a summary of the complaint and a summary of the police report. So before I start describing, I want to see if any of you have a sense of some of the issues and questions that this investigation should be looking at.
Well, I think, I guess initially, if the officers violated department policy with regard to the interaction with Mr. Johnson.
Yes, absolutely. One of the most significant issues.
Whether the policemen were reacting emotionally to when Mr. Johnson started using the F-bomb.
Yes, absolutely. You would ask the officers about their emotional state. How did you may feel when he said that? What else?
Well, I guess the whole question of the techniques, the use of force issue. I mean, what was the basis for wanting him to pull him out of the car and doing it the way they did?
Right. You want to look at the department rules on their use of force, specifically justification and procedure for use of a taser, for use of a baton, or for use of a flashlight as a weapon. San Francisco Police Department bars officers from using a flashlight as a weapon, except in very extreme exigent circumstances, when maybe they don't have a baton, when they're in a fight for their life, because they recognize a flashlight can cause far more harm to someone than a wooden baton can. So you would get all those policies, you would review them, and that would form a basis for many of the questions you're going to ask the officers. And again, it goes to what was your training? What was your understanding of this policy? Because if you are going to sustain a complaint, you're going to sustain it on the basis of an officer's failure to adhere to a specific policy. And that's going to be cited in the report. Or if it's failure to adhere to a certain law, let's say law of search and seizure, you're going to reference that law. And much the same way in a criminal case, someone is charged with a specific offense, the officer is being charged with potential violation of these specific rules. Other questions or issues?
Well, they took photos of the officers' injuries, but not of Mr. Johnson's.
You'd want to know if they took those photographs and what the procedure is. Yes, absolutely. Because that could be one of those, an allegation of additional misconduct that Mr. Johnson doesn't know about. But if they are required to do a use of force investigation that includes photographing subjects' injuries, and they didn't do it, then whoever was responsible for that would have an allegation against them. And maybe that is one of the officers at the scene. Maybe it is whoever took, I think it was Officer Snow who took the photographs, or whoever is supervising them, and perhaps reviewing that report and saying, wait a minute, where are the photographs of this person who injured his head when he hit the part of the seat? So again, it's a matter of who is responsible, because an internal investigation is looking at these things from the perspective of what does management need to do to effectively manage their department. And if there's a problem, they need to address it. They need to address it with all the officers. And it doesn't mean an officer is going to be disciplined. Maybe an officer needs to get some better training. Maybe they need some better supervision. Maybe they're not performing well in that particular assignment and they can be transferred to somewhere else. But again, the employer wants to know where the deficiencies in the behavior of their employees, the police officers, and how can they address this so they have better relations with their customers, which are members of the public. Any other questions or issues that we want to look at?
The discrepancy of whether any of the other patrons were wearing a hat versus solely Mr. Johnson.
Yes, absolutely. You'd want to look at what is the ordinance about hats. Also, how often is that enforced? And is it selective enforcement? Yeah, that's a very significant issue. What else?
We're going to see a lot of that, I think, too, over the next year if we still find ourselves wearing masks. And I think we're probably I see a video pop up every now and again where people refuse to wear masks in various places. That's what that part about the hat kind of makes me think of. And, you know, not everybody's going to be treated equally in those scenarios either, most likely, just based on our American history. So
yes,
it's kind of interesting to see how that plays out in, you know, various places.
Yeah, I'll say as an aside, California law now protects people for discrimination based on hair, style, or texture. On the basis that someone who might have hair in cornrows or something that they cannot be treated differently than someone with hair like mine. Recognizing that can often be, you know, a surrogate for discrimination based on race. So we might see that in some of these cases. Any other questions that come to mind?
When do you talk to someone about, like an officer, about their implicit bias? I mean, is that a question that comes up that they bring with them?
Yes. If the investigation indicates that there might have been some disparate treatment, and at this point we don't know whether Mr. Johnson or any of his companions has said, I feel the officer treated me this way because of my race, you would want to ask the officer about that, because that would then become an allegation. There would be, we would categorize it. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I was thinking about it in the realm of, you know, speaking to a time prior to their involvement as a law enforcement officer, when they had an interaction with someone of the, you know, of an opposite race or an opposite ethnicity. And, you know, how did that go? If it was not a positive interaction, you know, you might bring that deep-seated feeling or whatever that is with you as you go through the trainings that they, I'm sure, are given in these areas. But sometimes it's very difficult to do a lot of that self-work, because that's what that is, and how that may play into such as what Mr. Johnson could say, that I was treated differently than, you know, other people.
Yes. That kind of issue with someone with past experience, that really should be addressed during the hiring process, during the screening process. And I don't know what the process is in Charlottesville and San Francisco. I think they have a psychological screening. They do ask people questions about their cultural sensitivity and awareness. And there's a block of training in the police academy on cultural awareness, where they have people from different communities in San Francisco come and talk to officers, so they will have an understanding of those communities. But that's something that should come up in the screening process, in the interviewing process, about your past experience with people from different communities, your feelings about them. And if an officer can't let go of those concerns or those potential biases, they shouldn't be an officer. They shouldn't be hired in the first place. So issues like that would be framed as selective enforcement or selective treatment based on, you know, race or ethnicity or another protected category. Unfortunately, they've been very difficult to prove, because you have to either get an admission from an officer or show by looking at their history of similar behavior with similarly situated individuals, a pattern of disparate treatment. So for instance, if you look at an officer's record of contacts for several weeks every time he detains someone, and it's time consuming. You contact them and find that for all the African-American individuals he stops, he asks them, are you on probation or parole? But he doesn't ask that of white individuals he stops. That might give you sufficient evidence to show selective enforcement. But again, it's time consuming. And at least in California, fairly infrequent. Yes?
Yeah, I was gonna, there's no mention of, I guess, the threatened employee. There's no narrative for the alleged threatened employee in the report. And I guess you would ask about that.
Yes, and you'd want to see, did the theater prepare a report? Because often corporate entities have a procedure where if there's any unusual occurrence, if someone is ejected, that a report is written if someone comes back and sues them, they will have that for their legal department. So you'd want to ask, what is your procedure for this, documenting this? Report was written, can I have that? Now they may give it to you or they may not. You might need to subpoena it. But yes, you would, because that might contain the first person account of the theater employees. It would also be important to know what the theater manager told the officers when they came in, because you're really going to be examining this from the perspective of what information did the officers have at each stage of this event. If they were told merely that people were making noise and they come in, very aggressive, well, that may be a disproportionate response to this. So you're going to know what they were told by communications, by the dispatch operator, what the theater operator told them, what any other employee in the theater told them. Other things you think of?
Something indirect. A lot of the pushback that we are getting from law enforcement individuals here is that we will not, if we have, here's the first question is, what organizational structure do you conduct your investigations under? What kind of powers do you have? How does it work in San Francisco?
Well, I've worked in San Francisco and currently I'm working in Oakland. So in both those locations, the police department has a policy mandating that officers cooperate with investigations. Both agencies have subpoena power. They also have an established protocol for obtaining documents and evidence from the police department. In San Francisco, they had a timeline. Most documents had to be produced within 48 hours, or they had to provide a justifiable reason why they could not meet that deadline. Others, I think, within 10 working days, but there were certain things we had immediate access to. We had a computer terminal on which we could pull up a computer-assisted dispatch records, and I think Cami sent you a document describing those, and could also query their incident report system for whether someone's name appeared in a police report as a suspect, witness, or victim. So those were very valuable in identifying who the officers were, the scene, when and where this happened, a whole range of other information. And then we'd have to actually request the hard copy of the incident report. So we had a fairly robust direct access to the materials and information and sources of information that we needed.
Yeah, because some of the pushback that we're getting right now is that, look, the police are set up to gather information. How are you going to get a complainant to trust you? How are you going to get CCTV camera footage? who's going to let you take pictures of their injuries? Basically, what do you do about reluctant witnesses? And all of those issues are raised as, objections to why the board should do investigations rather than the police department. Do you have any reaction?
Well, my personal opinion, and this is I'm not speaking on behalf of NACOL or any of the agencies I've worked for, is that having civilians do the investigations has some very distinct advantages. Given the model that you have, one way you can make an impact is you are all very connected with your communities. So you can attempt to influence how internal affairs does its work and teach them to do it better. Possibly through the executive director's communications with the chief of police, to filter down. I don't know if you'll be having, how much direct contact you will be having with personnel in internal affairs, but, kind of talking to them about how you address someone's reluctance, why someone might be suspicious of the police, and talk about some of the things we mentioned, explaining the process to someone, being patient, showing that you're really listening, that you're interested. That goes a long way to establishing rapport and gaining trust. And it's a gradual process. And some of it will be, I know you're going to be able to do community outreach. In San Francisco and Oakland, when that's done, often there's someone from the police, one or more people from the police department who will go to those community meetings to hear that input and to speak to the community. So you're a really valuable bridge, at this stage of what you have, of the model you have, to help the police department do its job better, not just with internal affairs, but generally, because they have a very strong vested interest in having the community trust them. It's going to make their job easier. And unfortunately, we have the tragic incidents in various cities of a shooting or a significant incident. If you haven't built up those lines of communication and trust, that's where you're going to see some flashpoints, some significant friction. But when you have built up communication and trust, it goes a long way towards giving the department and your commission credibility to say, the investigation is taking place. It will be revealed as available, just trying at every stage, trying to be as transparent as you can. And as I said, that begins with the very first moment you meet the complainant and explaining what the process is and what the interview is going to be like, giving them information and giving them a sense of power.
I think, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think, I guess there was a look of something can be gathered via search warrant versus, not gathering the same information via subpoena. And that's why there is less desire or what have you to lend weight towards the board doing the investigation versus reliance on the police department doing the investigation itself. And so, does that make sense at all? Or are you gathering?
It doesn't, and I don't want to get too sidetracked on
Sure.
subpoena power, but
Sure.
my understanding, I'm not a lawyer, is that search warrants are issued in criminal cases, not in administrative investigations, which is what internal affairs is doing. Now, there may be a side of internal affairs that does do criminal investigations. And that should be very separate from an administrative investigation. And that would be to determine, did the officers violate the law? And if so, is the district attorney or prosecutor going to prosecute them? So for instance, in Mr. Johnson's case, if what he is alleging is true, this could very likely be a criminal prosecution for improper use of force and for falsifying a police report about how he had sustained his injuries. We don't know that yet. But we made this scenario very complex with a lot of factors, so it would give you an idea of various types of records that come into play in investigation. But no, in the administrative investigation, which is what I've always done, which is what you would be doing if you had investigative powers, you can't issue search warrants. You can't issue subpoenas. And that's what you would use to get CCTV footage. Search warrant would be something like you want to go into someone's home and search it and seize a particular object, which I have never seen done in an administrative investigation. The closest that would come would be searching a police officer's locker. And there they have certain legal protections. So in Mr. Johnson's case, for instance, they might want to examine or potentially seize the officer's flashlight that was allegedly used to strike him, to see if it matched his injuries, if there were patterns to those injuries. Potentially there could even be DNA evidence, though I don't know what resources the department would have to check that, based on other crimes they're investigating.
One other suggestion or discouraging word that we have heard is that it won't be possible for who will probably be a contract investigator to identify the acts that constitute misconduct. And so, and therefore the investigation cannot be effective. Now, we do have a disciplinary matrix with a whole bunch of rules and regulations, but nonetheless, we've heard that.
Are the rules? I looked on the website. I didn't see the rules for the Charlottesville Police Department on their website. Are they publicly accessible?
Yeah, they're under general orders.
Oh, okay. Okay, I must have missed them. I looked quickly. But yeah, so then the contract investigator would have access to those rules and would be able to know. And from my understanding, I did a quick reading of your ordinance. The contract outside investigator would be looking at an investigation that Internal Affairs had done that your board had determined was incomplete. So they would have that material. They would see what allegations had been identified. They can see what rules, what general orders were applicable, and evaluate the entire investigation. I assume also the analysis and the finding.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges for us right now is that we've had new state legislation that greatly broadens our potential powers, including the power to immediately initiate an investigation and not wait for IA to finish. Mm-hmm. And that's the context where this came up. So,
okay. Well, I would be an advocate of you getting greater authority and powers, but given what you have now, I want to, give you information that will help you to review the internal affairs investigations in a
sure. Yeah.
intelligent,
thank you.
Critical manner. And the questions you're asking are really good about, identifying the issues and questions that would come to bear in this case.
And Jason, can I jump in real quick just
yes.
to speak on that just for a moment? So just to clarify, any oversight agency that has someone who is doing investigations, whether it's on a contractual basis or it's an employee of the agency, it's really important that they have specialized and get investigative training. I think the assumption is sometimes when people make the arguments that I'm hearing is that civilian oversight just hires civilians off the street with no experience. And that's just not the case. You get the person with the qualifications that you specify. And if that is someone who has highly specialized training in investigations, then that's who you get. So I think knowing that that's how civilian oversight operates might help alleviate some of those fears. We have a great example here of someone who's been doing administrative investigations for over 40 years. That's the type of investigators that civilian oversight employs.
And there are some very qualified people who are former police officers. And I mentioned I'm doing an investigation for Oakland. There's a former chief of police of Sacramento, Rick Brazil, who's also examining how they handled the protests for internal affairs. And he did a similar investigation in Ferguson, Missouri, looking at the militarized response to the protests there. So he has very high qualifications. So there are people like that out there who can come in, who have a lot of expertise and can evaluate an internal affairs investigation and go, yay, nah, not up to snuff, not really up to standards, deficient in these areas. And I'm hoping that you won't encounter that, but the resources are there for you, for it to be addressed, as Cami said. So look, I'm just going to go through some of the issues and questions. And, you know, when I do an investigation, I want to break down everything into a series of smaller questions that need to be answered. So you touched on some of them. And again, you know, everything that happened in the theater, have they been causing a disturbance? Have they been asked to leave? The information the officers got from people at the theater, and also any prior experience at this theater. Have they been to this theater 6 times in the last month because of disturbances or fights? And are they going in, they're going, oh no, another blank that we have to deal with because they don't, you know, enforce the rules there or whatever, because they have a bad element. And that would be an issue of potential bias, preconceived assumptions about what's happening there. You'd want to know about the physical environment, the size of the theater, the lighting, how many people were in there, what film was being shown, and perhaps what point in the film was the film still playing when the officers were speaking to these people? Because if it's an action sequence with a lot of explosions, then people might not be able to hear what's being said, people several rows away. But if it's a very quiet scene, well, they are going to be able to hear more clearly. You want to know what equipment the officers had. So I want to know right away, did the officer who used the flashlight, according to Mr. Johnson, were they equipped with a baton or did they leave it in the car? Leaving it in the car could potentially be a violation of their rules. And, you know, just breaking down the interaction between the officers and Mr. Johnson and his friends. What was the initial verbal interchange? What force was used when he was in his seat? All of his actions, Mr. Johnson's actions when he was in his seat. Did the officers swear at him? The circumstances of the taser use, and what constituted his attack on the officers. You know, that's kind of a general term in the incident report. So you'd want to ask them, you know, describe what they did step by step. Sometimes I'll ask an officer, could you please demonstrate what that person did or what you did or where you grabbed them or how you grabbed them? You know, the location of the struggle on the floor, what the seat looked like. That's something you would want to photograph. The cause of the officer's injuries. Exactly how were those sustained? Was it coming into contact with an object, coming into contact with a complaint, with someone else, and how did he come into contact with them? Those are all things that need to be explored. It is possible, I have in some cases taken injury photographs and medical records to the medical examiner in San Francisco for an expert opinion on what are these injuries consistent or inconsistent with. So is this consistent with a fist? Would this be consistent with a baton strike? And when someone is struck with a police baton in soft tissue, it's often going to leave a kind of a characteristic bruise that will develop because of the shape and size of the baton that an expert could look at and say, yes, this is consistent or it's not consistent. So that would be something that would be important here because you're looking at some possibly significant injuries and possible significant misconduct. And as you brought up earlier, the issue of the hats. How frequently has someone been arrested in this jurisdiction for wearing a hat in a theater? Is this some 80-year-old ordinance that hasn't been enforced and the officers pulling it out because they don't like Mr. Johnson? The complainants, the complaint and history for those officers, and the history of similar incidents. And that's something you might be able to get through the record of their complaints or looking up certain codes for calls in their incident reports, or doing a computer search that might have two terms, their name and movie theater as place of occurrence. So you can identify some of those. And some of the, I just want to review some of the allegations that you could have. So first, the Officer Rice ordering Mr. Johnson to remove his hat. Officer Rice telling him to show some respect. Again, we mentioned selectively enforcing the no hats law. The rest of the complaint, was that justified? And each element of the officer's use of force. So grabbing his arm, trying to take him out of his seat, the use of the taser, hitting him with the head, and the injury to his arm, the use of profanity, and the threat to him in the ambulance. Those would all be potentially separate allegations, and you would peg them to specific rules in that department. So, yes. So I guess now we can move to the investigation plan. So I mentioned that you should have one of these for every investigation. So first of all, you can have the police communication records. I mentioned them. What information was communicated to the dispatcher by the caller from the theater? And what did they broadcast to the officers? And not just broadcast, but what information might have been on the officer's mobile video terminal or mobile display terminal in their car. You want to know what was all the information the officers had at the time they walked into the theater. The audio recording of the call and the dispatch. And also the audio recording of the call for backup, the call for additional officers. And that can be very important because it is going to give you a sense of what's happening. If that officer sounds like they're really out of breath, that would be consistent with a struggle. If you hear voices in the background, that can be very important. So you want to get that, listen to that carefully. Presumably all the officers there should have written an individual statement. So you want to get those. They may not be incorporated into the summary incident report that I sent you. As I mentioned in the guide to the documents, many police departments require a separate use of force report whenever a certain level of force is used. Now, it might be in the main police report. It might be in a separate document. There might be a required use of force investigation, which will require when someone sustains an injury, and that's the case in San Francisco and Oakland. A supervisor has to come out and conduct an on-the-spot investigation. And that would involve things like photographing injuries, identifying and interviewing witnesses, interviewing the injured party, and then writing up their findings, writing up all the evidence they gathered. So that might be a very separate document that should be obtained. Names and contact information for audience members. Nowadays, many people buy their tickets for a movie online using a credit card. When they get to the theater, there's a machine. They put in their credit card, they select their seat. So that would potentially give you a record. Those records would probably have to be subpoenaed. But again, that's one way of identifying people who are in there and are going to be presumably neutral witnesses. And particularly because you had, I think Mr. Johnson saying that someone was probably filming this with their phone. Getting that video would be extremely important. And obviously one of the first things you'd want is the body worn camera footage, if officers are wearing them and if they turn them on. That could be a real shortcut in this investigation. It might indicate that it happened exactly as the officers described, or it could indicate that it happened very much the way Mr. Johnson described. And in that case, this might be referred for criminal prosecution or criminal investigation. The ambulance records, he was transported in an ambulance. And you'd want, if he consented to sign a HIPAA medical release, you'd want his medical records from the ambulance, from the hospital, and from the jail, and from any subsequent treatment he received. Because again, you want to be able to document the nature of that injury, and potentially it can be taken to an expert, or it may state in itself that about the nature of the injury. Any citations that Officer Rice prepared for any of these offenses. I mentioned in that document prisoner transfer records. If he was transferred with other prisoners, again, contemporaneous statements. What did he say to them about what happened? If he made consistent statements all along the line to the other guys in the wagon and the transport, to the other guys, and I'm saying guys because prisoners typically are segregated by sex or gender, in the holding cell or in the jail. What do you tell them about what happened? If it's consistent, that's going to reflect on his credibility. The booking documents, which I mentioned in that the guide I gave you, the photographs of the officer's injuries, the officer's training records. How recently had they been trained on use of force? How recently had the officer who deployed their taser received training on use of a taser? Presumably, use of a taser is something that's going to be infrequent. So it's a perishable skill unless it's refreshed. So you kind of have it in muscle memory that it's not going to come into play properly. The records of Officer Peters' previous taser discharges. When a taser is deployed, there's an electronic record, and often they'll often be, with the newer tasers, there's also a video. So those could be requested. Is this someone who's tasing people right and left all the time in an unjustified fashion? And that's going to be a larger issue than just this case. It's going to reflect again on supervision, because there are records of that. Is the supervisor aware of this? Are they intervene in any way to say these, using your taser out of policy? And tasers can cause death, so that they can't be a deadly weapon. So that could be relevant. Dispatch records of other calls from this theater or police responses to this theater. As again, do police have a certain perception of this theater, of what happens there? Are they calling police all the time? Are police possibly getting impatient with them? And similarly, police reports generated from incidents at the theater. And do they involve any similar issues? Could those perhaps show disparate treatment of how they're treating individuals who the theater asked them to come and deal with? Mentioned the records regarding arrest for wearing a hat in the theater. Records of arrest by officers Rice or Peters for wearing a hat in the theater, and for assault on an officer, and for resisting arrest. Some people claim that officers will charge someone with resisting arrest when they have used unnecessary force as a way to justify the force or to undercut that person's credibility. So if officers are making frequent arrests for resisting, and those resisting charges are being dismissed by the district attorney, that may say something about a pattern of that officer's behavior. And again, and I know because you won't have the direct investigative powers, you will have limited effect on this, but any administrative investigation should be looking for these larger issues, these longer range patterns of behavior, because they're going to reveal more significant problems than just this officer at this location at this time. So then physical evidence. So we mentioned complaints of and photographs of the complainant's injuries. You want to get these as quickly as possible. If the bruising develops several days afterwards, you may want to ask him to come back, and you may want to go to his home and take photographs of that. The person doing the photographs should get some training. These aren't photographs you necessarily just want to take with your cell phone camera. You want to take them in appropriate lighting. The type of lighting can affect color in photographs, and that's particularly relevant when you're photographing bruises. And it can distort the color. So sometimes I would include I forget what they call it, a color sheet. And so you can match the photograph with that color sheet to see how true the colors are. We mentioned the body worn camera recordings, the taser download. CCTV footage from cameras inside or outside the theater. There might be some inside. There might be some in the lobby or outside the theater. They may show something that may be useful. They might have captured the officer making a gesture as he's leading Mr. Johnson out that shows some disdain or disrespect. You just don't know until you get it. And again, I'm talking about a wide constellation of possible evidence and records. Not always going to be relevant to the particular case, but I think it's important to know what is out there. And for anyone who's doing these type of investigations, to have these in mind and to recognize that these are potential sources of information that they may want to gather, that they may not have thought of otherwise. And NACO's trainings, there are other trainings that make people aware of this if they haven't had that experience. Photographs of clothing worn by the complainant at the time of his arrest. This may be useful because someone may be talking about, I saw someone in the theater doing X. Can you describe them? Well, I couldn't see them clearly, but I remember he was wearing a red shirt or is wearing a green shirt. Well, if you know what the complainant was wearing, that can help identify him in that witness's mind. It's also going to show, is there blood on the clothing? Are the clothing damaged? Is it consistent with him, with the takedown, with the physical treatment by the officers? Now, obviously, mentioned the cell phone video or any audio recordings, mentioned the baton or flashlight, and photographs of the theater. You want to see the dimensions, you want to see the sight lines, you want some very detailed photographs of that seat and the area where the officers claim Mr. Johnson struck his head. You want to do that both with and without a scale, with and without a ruler, to see distances and that whole area where the takedown occurred, where he would have been on the floor or the steps, whatever it is. And if you've interviewed witnesses, you might want to take photographs from their seats. Again, if they bought their seats online or through that kiosk in the lobby, it's going to indicate what their seat was. You can go there. And again, you're going to need the theater cooperation. Go there and take photographs from that seat showing what the sight line is to where the complaint to Mr. Johnson and his friends were seated. So any questions about the things we just described, the physical evidence or the documentary evidence? Okay, let's go on.
I want to say I noticed the police report didn't mention anything about witnesses. I mean, I know it was a summary, but it's a movie theater, right? So you would expect, there's going to be, anywhere from at least 10 people to maybe 60, 70 people. As you mentioned earlier, of course, that also depends on whether it was the beginning of the movie, but it was probably the movie had probably started, right? Because somebody's more likely to complain when the movie's actually in motion. So I noticed they totally left that out, anything about witnesses. So, and then I didn't say much earlier, but I was just thinking, it's like a classic case of a lack of de-escalation, because it said that they were sitting in the front of the theater. And even if it's like two little kids and somebody goes down to the very front to say something during a movie, that's going to take everybody's attention. So you instantly know, no matter who it is, if you grab somebody's arm, right, and they're sitting in a movie that they just paid for, and they're in the very front row, it's 90% of the time, no matter who it is, even if Mother Teresa's sitting there, you grab her arm, it's going to explode every time. So
absolutely. And that goes to what someone said earlier about the officer's emotional state. Were they testy? Were they impatient? That's not a good way to de-escalate. If you come in, you've got with the attitude, I'm the boss, do what I say, you've got to respect me, as opposed to, hey, we've got a situation here, let's try and resolve it. There are a lot of different ways to approach someone. You hit that on the head, de-escalation. What you said about what would be included in the report, whether it should include witnesses, and there you go to the department's policy on how reports should be written and the training officers receive. And what does it say about when you should obtain witness statements? So if you have a situation where someone resists, do you want to get statements from civilian witnesses, or simply say officer statements are sufficient, or you've got body worn camera footage? You'd want to obviously want to ask, did any members of that audience come down as they were leading him out and say, what you did was wrong? Or say, I want to talk to you, I want to make a statement. And if the officer says, oh, no, that's not important, I don't need your name, well, that's also going to be a potential violation of rules. So that, and that's something the theater personnel might say, because presumably they may be walking out with the officers, and ask them, did anyone from the audience, anyone talk to the officers? What did the officers say? What was their manner like? And that's going to be difficult information to obtain, because they may feel they're dependent on the police to resolve issues, so they may not want to say anything bad about them. But you want to make that effort. It's something that it's a source of information that could be explored. Any other questions or comments on the things we just discussed?
Yeah, it's very practical. So for Mr. Johnson's case, ballpark, kind of what kind of resources would it take to complete an investigation like this? Time, money?
For something like this, it's going to take a fair amount of time because of the complexity, the number of allegations, because of the seriousness of the allegations. As I said, the physical injury and the potential falsification of a police report, which in many departments would be, that in itself would be enough to fire an officer.
Yeah.
And that's something that could be proven by documenting what that seat looked like and where the officer says he struck his head. And if there's nothing there that's going to, on that seat, an edge or a bolt or something that's going to be consistent with the type of injury he received, that's going to be a significant issue. I said it could be a criminal offense. So I would say you're looking at 100, 200 hours. You've got Mr. Johnson, his companions, you've got the search for civilian witnesses in the theater, you have 4 police officers, potentially body-worn camera footage, personnel at the theater, a lot of records, and you want to do a lot of this quickly. And when I talked about perishable evidence, about someone's recollection fading, if an incident is unusual for someone, it's more likely to stand out. If it's fairly routine, it's not. So I found if I interview an officer about a traffic stop they made 2 or 3 months afterwards, they're going to say, I've made dozens of traffic stops since then. That one doesn't really stand out. I don't remember it very clearly. But if we or I are stopped by a police officer, hopefully that's a fairly rare occurrence. That's going to stand out, and we may remember it better, and we're going to tell people about it. We're going to go home and tell our partner or our friends or our roommates, hey, I just got pulled over by a cop. And so it's more likely to stand out. So, when I'm evaluating those things, if it's an incident that happens in a neighborhood where there's a lot of police activity, where people are arrested all the time, a month later, if you do a canvass, witness is less likely to remember that specific incident, because that may happen, unfortunately, routinely. But in some neighborhoods, they're going to say, no one's ever been arrested on this street. Everyone was looking out their window. That was really strange. And they are going to remember that. Any other questions, comments about documents or evidence?
So you may have talked a little bit about this previously. But a lot of the complaints that we get, as you would expect, one of the reasons why I wanted to be part of this is oftentimes the first thought is there's racial bias, right? I think it said there were 3 African American males in the theater, and so chances are if we receive that here, that's going to be one of the things that they will the complainant will say. And, we haven't done the investigation on this particular circumstance, but, what are some of the things that, you know, we could look for to see if, you know, in fact, there was racial bias. You know, if had it been three white teenagers making noise at the movie theater, would they just be asked to quiet down? Is it because, like the guy you said, the Hispanic guy that came in with the tattoos, I think you mentioned a while ago, you know, is it because it's three African-American males? And I say that because, you know, as African-Americans, as we meander through this experience of life, you know, there's always sort of that question, right? Even returning something recently here in Charlottesville, somebody really questioned whether I had purchased it there. And I thought it was a complete joke. I'm standing there with my kids.
Mm.
So these scenarios happen pretty frequently, where you don't really know, why are you treating me this way? I'm just trying to go about my day.
Mhm.
And but you don't always have a solid grasp, tangible piece of evidence, right? And so in here, when I see it, it seems that way, but I don't know what are some of the things, you know, far from somebody saying a racial, you know, a word that would be not ideal, you know, what would you point at, right? To assuming that, you know, this is pointing to sort of discrimination.
Right.
Question, I know.
Really good point to raise. Well, first of all, you should ask Mr. Johnson at some point during the interview, why do you think the officers acted the way they did? And he may say, I think it was because of my race. Or he may say, you know, I was on a baseball team and we beat that officer's son, and he was there and he didn't like it because we won. There might be some personal reason. Or that officer arrested my brother and he just doesn't like my family. But that's an important question to ask. Why do you think this happened? Why do you think the officers acted as they did? And then there are things you can do, like asking the theater staff, have you had to call the police before about anything like this? And, you know, what happened? And how did they, can you describe that interaction? Do you often have people wearing hats in the theater? And have police ever come when people were wearing hats in the theater? And what did they do? You know, it's unfortunately, as I say, at least in California, it's been difficult to prove biased policing allegations. In the EEO investigation world that I was in for 3 years, you look at disparate treatment of similarly situated individuals. So you want to, again, other people, officers encountered in the theater wearing a hat. Were they told to take it off? Were they cited for that? Who do they ask? Are they on probation or parole? And are they similarly situated? You know, and for instance, traffic stops. There's an officer going up to the every African-American driver they ask and interacting with them in a certain way, and interacting in a different way with white drivers, Caucasian drivers, they stop. And that may be reflected on the body-worn camera footage. So again, that can be time consuming, but it can potentially show a pattern. And you ask the officer, you know, why did you do this? You would ask them for each of their actions. And why did you mention the hat? And why did you say anything about respect? Why did you say that? Is that something you say to other people? And, oh, well, tell me about those other occasions. How often do you do that? How often do you say those things? See, the officers have to be questioned about them. They have to be asked, did this person's race play any role in why you treated them as they did?
I appreciate that.
Yeah. And I appreciate the concern. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
They have been difficult allegations to prove, but it's not impossible to prove them. They have been proven. So, and that's why a lot of departments are requiring reporting on traffic stops and detentions, where they document the individual's sex, race, ethnicity, the reason for the stop, whether they were cited or arrested, whether a search was conducted, whether the officer asked for consent to search, because that's another area where we're seeing significant disparities based on race of individuals being asked for consent to search their vehicles. They found it much more with African-American drivers than with white drivers. And they found they discover contraband less often with African-American drivers than with white drivers. So you can look at an officer's individual records there, and that may show a pattern. And there have been some experts who have written about this and spoken at NACO conferences about the range and size of the data set you need to sort of establish those things. But because these records are being computerized, you can have those data sets. And it's something that you as a body can ask the police department to look at and make a report on, to have someone with some training and some expertise analyze that data and make a public report and offer explanations for why they think there might be disparities. And that's, again, a way of looking at systemic issues, bringing them to the attention of the community and ensuring that the city manager and the city council are aware of these issues and that they're going to ask police managers to address this and to document it.
Jason,
Yes.
I just wanted to add, so although your ordinance doesn't specify that you have access to everything, it does specify that you have access to raw and aggregated data on the investigations that are being done, whether they're timely, information about the findings, the dispositions. And that mixed with you doing thorough reviews of the cases that you were able to, I think can go a long way with finding those issues and making sure that all of those questions that Jason are talking about are being asked every single time. And that will eventually bring about information, and it will also show that you are expecting thorough and fair investigations every single time. And it'll take some time, but hopefully it will get to the point where you can help deal with some of the issues that might be systemic to the policing there.
And you can very easily make the case to a chief of police and other police managers that it's very much in their interest to have thorough and effective investigations so they can identify problem areas, particularly systemic issues like policy or training, because that will help them avoid complaints, avoid lawsuits, avoid injuries to officers or to members of the public, and avoid having officers whose misconduct has gone unrecognized or unaddressed. And then you have a very tragic shooting, and often a chief of police will lose their job. Chiefs of police want to keep their job. So it's in their interest to identify these problems early on and address them, hopefully when they're small, and maybe get rid of problem officers, change the training, change the policy. And it's going to make their life much easier, and the city council's life easier, and the city manager's life easier. Any other questions, comments about the physical evidence or witnesses or documents we discussed before we move on to witnesses? Okay.
I would just say real quick, taking a scenario like this, I would think that this would be a good training scenario for a police department, because black, white, or whatever, if you have adults sitting in a movie theater and they're in the front row and people are watching a movie and cops come in the building, you're going to have a problem, period. Like, as I was saying earlier. So, how does somebody properly, if your job is, if the theater thought it was necessary to actually call the police and not just have the manager go down there and say, hey guys, can you quiet down? Nothing good is going to come out of the scenario, right?
Mm-hmm.
Particularly, they said they're sitting in the front row. I've only ever sat in the front row when all the rows behind me were packed, because it's a terrible seat, right? You're looking straight up in the air.
Uh-huh.
So it just from looking at it from that other lens is like, what, and we don't need to answer it now, but how do you handle these situations, right? Like, how do you confront people, get everything worked out, and keep it moving, essentially, when you're at the front of the stage all of a sudden, right? When two or three police show up,
Mhm.
they're in a movie. So, that it would be interesting to hear this perspective of, I have ideas of what they should have done, how they should have done it, right? But, what is the proper way to address people in that scenario?
You might have already told me this, and I apologize if you have. Do you have training scheduled with CPD?
As of now, I don't believe we do.
Okay. I just know some agencies and review boards schedule trainings on specific topics if there's a list of things that you'd like to know so that you have a better understanding what their procedures are in specific situations. It may be helpful as you're reviewing investigations to be able to say, well, yes, they did this. They told us that this is A, B, and C in the process when we have this situation, or they told us something completely different. It may be helpful in the long run, just something to think about.
Yeah, well, we have in our ordinance a requirement that our executive director arrange for training with the police department, but we haven't had an executive director yet, so
Okay,
it hasn't happened.
soon, fingers crossed,
Are you
Well,
able
that you'll
to?
have the executive director for sure.
But in going back to James's question, that would have been covered in basic. And then you can see what the module of the training there, what type of crisis intervention was, and how that training was carried out.
Are you able to do now, or will you be able to do ride-alongs?
Yes, we are able to request those with the CPD. I know that a few of the members have that on the agenda, but obviously due to the COVID slowdown, that hasn't taken place yet.
When I started in this field in 1983, and as I said, I'd been a defense investigator, I had some familiarity with police records, but I wanted to know everything I could about police work. So I did ride-alongs every weekend for the first 9 or 10 weeks. And I asked the captain to be able to address the watch, because they were all going to know this is a civilian, someone from the oversight agency, which was then new. And I tell them, look, I'm going to be riding along. I'm not here to gather evidence. I'm here to learn what I can about what you do. Now, you may dislike or like the fact that this agency is in existence, that you now have civilian oversight. But the reality is, it's the law, it's here. I want to do as good a job as I can, and I want to learn everything I can about what you do and the challenges you face within the bounds of safety. And that earned me a lot of credibility, just saying, I'm open, please teach me. I also attended some police academy classes, which were very helpful, particularly one on assertiveness training, where they did exercises, the sort of thing you were talking about. It wasn't so much de-escalation, but how to control someone verbally without making an arrest or using force. How to do a traffic stop, things like that, demonstrations of, and they came out and did a demonstration for us in the gym of all the physical control holds they use and what they look like, what a bar arm takedown is, how they're trained to use a baton, that sort of thing. Very helpful. And in California, the Peace Officer Standards and Training curriculum is publicly accessible online. So if someone said you can perhaps get that training module and see how officers are trained and what standards they're being held to by the state of Virginia. Presumably Charlottesville has some additional requirements because it's an urban department. Okay, anything else, or should we move on to the witnesses who will be interviewed? So obviously, Mr. Johnson's companions, as I mentioned, the theater manager, theater employee who had contact with Mr. Johnson, his companions, audience members, potentially projectionists, because they may have heard some things. of the paramedics in the ambulance, because Mr. Johnson is alleging that he was threatened in the ambulance. But also you want to ask them about Mr. Johnson's demeanor and the officer's demeanor. Did the officer seem angry, upset? Was he brusque? Was his face red? And what Mr. Johnson might have said about his injuries. He may be saying, he hit me in the head, he hit me in the head. And again, those are contemporaneous statements. The medical personnel who examined and treated him at the hospital or the jail, because of their observations about his injuries and any statements he made about them, and also potentially the statements that the officer made, because they may ask the officer, oh, how did he, what happened to him? And the officer presumably will say what was in the report, but he might have said some variation of that. He may have hesitated in saying that. All of that is going to be relevant information for assessing the officer's credibility. And also jail personnel, because again, the complainant may have made statements to them. His manner, his demeanor is going to be potentially relevant. And presumably the arresting officer usually hands off custody at the jail. So there may have been some interaction there as well. Most jails have CCTV cameras that also record audio. So you might get officers' statements to the deputies. And sometimes those are going to be maybe more revealing because the officer is relaxed. They're talking to other law enforcement officers they deal with all the time. So they may be a little more candid there than they might have been elsewhere. Any thoughts, questions about the witnesses? And then obviously all of the police officers, I would typically interview witness officers first, particularly because in California, officers who are subject to discipline, who are the subjects of investigation, are allowed to have representatives. And often the same representative will represent multiple officers. So I want to interview the witness officers because they will not have a representative. They would not be allowed to audio record the interview. So they can't go out and give that audio recording to another officer who is present because I want to avoid contamination. Sometimes I will schedule the interviews close together, and one right after the other. So the officers won't have time to talk to one another about what they were asked or what they were said. And the investigator should show the same level of respect to everyone they interview, civilians, witnesses, officers. There should not be any sense of preference. You know, admittedly, I don't know how large your police department is, but there's a likelihood that internal affairs investigators may know some of the officers they're interviewing, they're investigating. They may have served with them, worked with them. And again, that may rise to the level of needing to conflict out of that investigation. But if you're going to listen to audio records, you don't want to see a lot of, how you doing, Fred? How's your wife? How's your kid? Yeah, obviously you want to establish rapport, but you don't want to be showing that you're closer to one party than to the other. So that's something to look for in audio recordings of interviews or the transcripts. There should not be a lot of conversation that is not recorded if they are typically recorded, because then there are going to be questions, what was said then that was not memorialized. And to address the issue of whether the officers have talked to other parties in the complaint, I will often ask them, have you reviewed any materials in advance of this interview? And have you spoken to anyone about it? And if they say, and if they're officer subject to discipline, obviously they have a right to speak with a representative. Sometimes that will be a lawyer. Sometimes it will be another officer who's on the board of directors of their union. And I can't ask about those communications because they're privileged. But if they talk to another officer, I will ask them a lot of questions about that conversation. What did you say? What did they tell you? What questions did they ask? Why did you ask them those questions? To see if they may be incorporated information from another source. That's something to address really with everyone you interview, because people are going to recount a description of an incident, and some of that may be direct experience, things they see or hear. Some of it may be assumptions or conclusions they made consciously or unconsciously. And some of that information may be things they've gotten from other sources, like the media, from other people who were present, from online sources. So you want to clarify that and make sure, okay, now is that what you saw specifically? And what did you hear? Because you don't want that to come up in a disciplinary hearing. And again, I had a lot of experience doing litigation investigations, sitting on trials where I'd done the investigation. You don't want a situation where you've interviewed someone and on cross-examination, the attorney asked them, did you see that yourself? And they go, well, no, not really. And that's suddenly going to diminish that witness's credibility. You want to learn that early on, and that should be part of the interview. And that may be, I've had police officers say, that's something I learned. That's a good lesson for me, because when I get out of internal affairs and I go back to doing criminal investigations, I want to do interviews that are going to be fairly tight. They're going to be thorough, and that the district attorney can rely on, because they're going to make a decision on how to charge someone. And that's going to affect the success of that prosecution. So they may not have that much experience taking cases to trial. And this can be a good learning opportunity for them that will make them a better investigator and a better police officer, make them more successful in their career. And then, any questions about witnesses? Okay, so then other sources would be potential social media sites. People who were in that theater may have posted what happened there. So you can do searches for that. Anyone who filmed that with their phone might have posted it to YouTube or to Facebook, any Twitter, and of the other areas. And there's a whole other area of officers' postings on social media. That's something that's just getting some publicity, where officers have had private Facebook groups in which they candidly discuss their feelings about members of the public or their police agencies or their rules. So I haven't done any of those investigations, but that's something that you should be aware of. In some agencies, it's closed officers expressing opinions that are very contrary to the values of that police agency and of that community. And people feel those officers really should not be working for those agencies with those attitudes. So that's something we're probably going to see more of. And I don't know whether your agency has a social media policy. Many do, saying that there's certain limitations on what an officer can put on social media relating to their work, relating to any representation of the agency or the community, and anything that's going to bring discredit on the agency or show bias or prejudice. So an emerging area of exploration. So any questions about that? So at the end of an investigation, after I've done all the witness interviews, I like to put that into a matrix. And this is a matrix that might have been prepared at the conclusion of Mr. Johnson's investigation, where you list different witnesses, his companions, the manager, 3 civilian witnesses, and the video that one of the civilian witnesses took. So I'll just give you a minute to look that over. So I just want to go through a few things here. I like to put these together because they help me organize the evidence, see it in graphic form. It also allows someone else who's going to review the file to see that without having to read through all the transcripts or all the interview summaries. And it shows you, where the evidence lies. So, for instance, under the column injuries to complainant's head. So you see two of his companions say they saw that. Now, friend number 2 says the male officer smashed him in the head 20 or 30 times. And that's something you'll sometimes encounter. People will misjudge the number of times something happens, the number of gunshots. They're focused on the motion. They're seeing this thing go up and down, and they may overestimate the number. But the fact that they saw it is significant. It's also very significant that the manager saw the male officer with a flashlight in his hand. Witness number 2 saw him raise his arm up and bring it down fast. They didn't see the flashlight. They didn't see it make contact. But what they saw is consistent with the officer striking him with a flashlight, with what Mr. Johnston alleged. Witness 3, also very typical. Someone is not focused on that element of what's happening. They're focusing on filming this. And I mean, a lot going on. We only had a limited amount of attention we can pay to something. So someone's not going to notice everything that's going on. The police officer isn't going to be able to recall everything that's going on. But you ask them about that, and the video shows the flashlight beam going up and down. That's a very significant piece of evidence. It would be plausible for the officer to be using their flashlight because the theater's dark and they want to see who they're dealing with. They want to see if they have any weapons. So he has the flashlight in his hand, and as he's moving it up and down, that beam is registering on the video, which, because it's dark in the theater, isn't going to get a great deal of detail, but it's going to pick that up. So any questions or comments about the matrix?
It seems pretty thorough and just gathers a significant amount of information that obviously would prove helpful or useful.
Yeah, just looking at that, you're going to see there's sufficient evidence to establish that the officer struck him in the head with a flashlight, that the officers used profanity, that the female officer told Mr. Johnson to be more respectful. Some things here are going to indicate, which witness was which. I think the multicolored hat, the tweed hat the person was wearing because he was recovering from chemotherapy because he didn't have hair. And it also reflects on, how the complainant and his friends were behaving. If they are giving consistent accounts on that, that's significant. If they deny it, if there's an inconsistency, you have to look at its import. So you got a bunch of teenagers. They may not want to admit that they were doing something wrong. There's a real difference between a teenager denying they did something minor wrong and a police officer denying that they did something. The police officer is an adult. They are trained to be truthful. They are trained to be accurate and specific about their actions. And they're operating under policy that says you must be truthful in your report. So if his friends, lied a little bit about what they were doing, whether they were yelling, whether they were, cursed at the officers, anything like that, would it be relevant? Yes. How relevant would it be? Somewhat, not greatly in terms of reflecting on their credibility, because there's a plausible reason why they would not be candid about that. Conversely, if you have someone who, and I've had this experience, someone comes in and says, yeah, I had the drugs on me. I was selling drugs, but I didn't fight that officer. He just slammed me into the ground, hit me 4 times. Well, they're admitting to illegal activity. So that's an admission of culpability about something, but that may enhance their credibility. Conversely, if someone is arrested for drug sales and they have $600 in their possession, I'm going to ask, hey, that's a lot of money. How come you had so much money with you? And if they say, you know, I got it out of the bank that morning because I was going to go buy a car, I say, great, can you get me, do you have the ATM slip, or could you send me a copy of your bank statement? Because that's going to be proof that they did not get that money from selling drugs. But if they tell me some meandering story about, well, I was supposed to meet this guy to buy a stereo from him, but I don't know his name, and yeah, I'm not sure where he lived, that's going to reflect poorly on their credibility. So, questions or comments?
How much do you look at? Well, there's two. So social media is a whole new ball game, right? In our world, and I don't know whether it's starting to take place of reality or is it fantasy or what it is, but so you got two sides, right? We're a board, you know, and my thought is from the board side, you got to kind of be careful about what you post as a board.
Absolutely.
People will try to delegitimize you. But then on the other side of, say you made this matrix, you interviewed, or this is based on the facts, it makes a lot of sense. But then, you know, if you got a couple of different YouTube videos or Facebook videos of these gentlemen being asked to leave the theater and pulled out, or, you know, basically pulled out their seats in the fight, you know, how do you, of course, they're going to have their version, right? And you don't know when the camera was started.
Mm-hmm.
The police will have their version. Maybe the movie theater will have their version. You know, have you found yourself, now that we're in the social media age, kind of trying to pull all these different videos together to get the full story? And, you know, because it's just it's a different time, but it's a good thing too, because when I was growing up, you know, people had to explain, hey, these cops beat me up, but there was no footage.
Mm-hmm.
But now there's a lot of footage. Sometimes, not always, but, you know, from different angles. You know, well, if you can just speak a little bit about maybe that, or the social media mix and how that all plays out.
I think it's wonderful that there are videos. Years ago, a community activist came to our agency talking about how people could prove complaints. And this was before the digital age. I said, the best thing you could do is give everyone a cassette tape recorder and have them turn it on when they have an encounter with a police officer. Now everyone has a video recorder on their phone. You have to recognize that the video shows a very limited perspective. It may not be showing the whole scene. And so you have to evaluate it based on that and in light of other evidence. It's very time consuming if you have multiple videos to kind of summarize them and sort of synchronize them, because they're showing things from different angles. You know, there's, and I forget who posted, maybe the New York Times posted some videos of an incident they staged, shown from two different angles. And from one angle, it looks like something very bad is happening. From the other angle, it shows something totally innocuous was happening. So that's a good example of how you have to look at those. You know, every case is different, but there's been trainings on video. NACO, we've had some trainings at NACO conferences by video experts on how to use video and evaluate it. I would hope that internal affairs investigators would also get similar types of training, because police are getting a lot of videos of crimes. I don't know what the extent you have CCTV cameras in Charlottesville that they may be using for prosecution of crimes or investigation of crimes. But it's another source of information that just has to be evaluated on its merits. And one thing I did want to mention, every investigation no two investigations are absolutely alike, but it's really helpful to have a very similar set of procedures for each investigation so you can show consistency. So you can say for every investigation, we get a thorough interview. We look at the allegations, we look at the rules, we get these records, and that forms the framework for the investigation plan. And we always do an investigation plan. And that way, if you're testifying or if your results of your investigation are challenged, you can say, we do it consistently every time. We have a protocol in our office, and every internal affairs office, every civilian investigative office should have a policy and procedures manual for how this should be done. And there's a really excellent one that a former NACO president put together for the Seattle Office of Police Accountability that is online. I can send Cammie the link and she can forward that to you. It's a really excellent guide. And that was done, he was a civilian supervising an internal affairs unit. And he took everything he'd learned as an oversight practitioner as a civilian and said, what do police investigators need to know, and put it in there. So that's a very good resource you can share with your internal affairs department. Other questions?
If there aren't any other questions, I will be providing the slide deck again to all of you. I'll send it to you, Bellamy, to then forward on if that's okay. And that does
Yes.
have Jason's email address on the last slide. So if there are additional questions that come up, please feel free to reach out to either of us. We're happy to help. And I realize, particularly as we get to the 2-hour mark, everybody is full of information and it's maybe a little difficult to come up with all the questions you might have. So.
And don't hesitate to contact me. I'm somewhat retired, so I have fairly flexible time, and civilian oversight is my passion. I left my job doing EO investigations because after George Floyd, I decided this is where I wanted to direct my energies. So being able to do this is just really a privilege for me. And I thank you for your work as civilian volunteer members of a board. I know how much time and energy that takes. And thank you for all the work you're doing and have done.
Thank you for sharing with us and giving us a bit more insight into how we can do that work more effectively. So.
And I think we will be seeing you again on April 29th. It looks like for our next for the educational session number 4. And
Does
then
that sound right, James?
Yeah, April 29th I'm tracking, and May 6th I think are the next two.
yes.
And that'll put us at what, about 5? I think at May 6th we'll have our fifth class. Kind of lost track of how many we need total though.
It's 6 total.
Okay.
So we can sometime in the next month or so come up with that last date.
Okay.
And then also kind of check in on the topics and make sure we don't need to do some adjustment. If there's some things that have come up that you'd like some additional training on.
Okay.
We just want to make sure that in those 6 sessions, we get you what you need. So.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Well, thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening and we'll see you next month.
Bye.
Thank you.
Right.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.